The Great Escape from Alcatraz occurred on June 11th, 1962, and is still considered to be one of the most audacious and ingenious prison escapes in American history. Four inmates were involved in the planning of the execution of the escape: Allen West, AZ number 1335, Frank Morris, pictured here, AZ number 1441, and brothers John Anglin, AZ number 1476, and Clarence Anglin, AZ number 1485. Working at night, the men chipped away at the concrete surrounding the air vent at the back of their cells to widen a hole that would allow them to access the utility corridor that runs through the middle of the cell block. We can look on our diagram here, and we've pointed this out a couple of times, and I have the individual cells marked for Morris, West, and the Anglin brothers. So this is B block. They were housed on the outside of B across the walkway from A block. And if you remember, A block was unoccupied, so these cells would have been completely empty, and nobody would have been able to see really what they were up to from across the cellway. So this little space right here is the utility corridor. So they're chipping their way through the air vent into that utility corridor. So here is just a photo of the inside of that corridor. Sometimes it's called a pipe chase. What this functions as, all the plumbing and electrical wiring and any kind of maintenance needs for individual cells would have been done remotely through the pipe chase, so that you wouldn't have had to have access or to go into the cell to access plumbing, to shut off water, or anything like that. So they're working their way out of the cells. All four of them are on the flats of the outside of B block, so they're on the first floor. So they're going to come through their cell, somewhere down here low, and their plan is to climb these pipes all the way to the top of the cell block. Here's kind of the route they took. So down here from the first floor, climbing up to the top of the cell block here. They would have had supplies and equipment that throughout their planning stage, they would have, for example, manufactured life jackets. They manufactured a raft, and a lot of that stuff would have been stored up here until the night of June 11th. Then they would have busted their way through this ventilator and climbed onto the roof of the cell block to make their escape. Allen West's main contribution, and pay attention that you can only see at any given time 3 figures, even though 4 were involved. His main contributions occurred during the day, gathering supplies, securing a place to store the supplies on top of the cell block. Unfortunately for him, on the night of June 11th, 1962, when his 3 associates were ready to go, he was still trying to get out of his cell. He waited until that night to finish digging his way out. He had used some concrete to reinforce part of the vent that he had chipped away, thinking it'd be really easy to smash through. It turned out to solidify a little harder and reinforce the vent more than he thought, and he had trouble getting through it. He begged Frank Morris to wait on him, to help him, but despite all that, they decided to leave without him. By the time he was able to chisel through that vent, it was probably well into the early morning of June 12th. Maybe 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, he made his way up this pathway onto the roof. Realizing that they were long gone, he decided to come back down into his cell, and he was ready to turn himself in the next morning when the staff realized that the men were gone. He said something along the lines of, "You might as well lock me up. I planned the whole escape." This is one of the big controversies. There's no doubt that Allen West played a big role Frank Morris was considered to be above average intelligence. He was a career criminal, spent most of his life in prison. He would have had the brains, and he would have been really, for the most part, in charge of this operation. However, Frank Morris isn't around to tell us this. We don't have a whole lot of information on the planning. We do know what some other inmates have told us, but Alan West is a figure that had a lot to say, claimed a lot of information. He had a lot of knowledge, so uh, it's hard to tell one way or the other who was really in charge. Maybe Alan West had the idea, and Morris put together the plan. Um, we'll never know that. But after climbing onto the roof of the building, they would have made their way across uh, across the roof to the north corner. They would have shimmied down an exhaust pipe that's no longer there, but they would have shimmied down the exhaust pipe to the old bakery, skirted around the water tower, and made their way just past um, the warehouse to the north shore. Uh, and according to West, their plan was from the north shore to utilize their raft and homemade flotation devices to make it out to the north of them on Alcatraz Island to Angel Island, and then from there cross that island and then swim across the strait to the mainland. Um, so that's kind of the best projections that we have are that was somewhat accurate. They didn't go south; they went north. And most investigations estimate that between 10 and 11 p.m. they would have launched the raft into the bay. So the mystery and things, the intrigue, um, the interest partly comes around like how did they from uh, just after lights out or 10 o'clock when they launch. So if you come back a little before that, maybe it took them an hour to get out, whatever. So around 9 o'clock, from 9 o'clock until 7 a.m. the next morning, they were unaccounted for. So all through the night during uh, night counts, they were accounted that guards realized that they were no longer in their cell. And the way they did that are through these little paper mache style heads. We won't call them paper mache because that probably is inaccurate. They would have used a lot of different materials. One of these heads was made out of like sheets and soap chips. There was probably newspaper, plaster, paint. They even collected real hair from the barber shop, and they laid these little dummy heads in the bed, piled up some blankets there to make it look like they were sleeping. So when the guards were walking by the cell at night, they appeared to be sleeping in their cell. Unbeknownst to them, they were climbing up the pipe chase, they were on the roof, they were climbing down the bakery exhaust vent, they were uh, launching a homemade raincoat raft into the bay on the northern shore of the island. So they had a huge head start. That's why um, it's so mysterious, is because if they had swum across um, and the guards had found them missing 30 minutes later, we'd have a much better chance of seeing them, catching them, being on the island when they swam, uh, launching boats. But I mean, all night long they had to survive. So that's what adds to this mystery. Whether or not they made it or not is how much time they had before the guards realized they were missing. So these paper mache style heads. This is cell 138, Frank Morris's cell. So you can see in the back the air vent. So they're hanging some towels there to kind of block this. During the day, they used some replica vent covers, one made of cardboard to kind of put in there and replicate that the cell was still intact. Here's another. This is, I think, John England's cell. You can see the big hole. just barely big enough for somebody to squeeze through, and they still have these dummy heads. So one of the things that we'll look at. So there's no record that anybody has seen or heard from Morse or the Anglin since lights out on June 11th, 1962. The mystery has engrossed the public, a lot like the mystery of D.B. Cooper. If you're not familiar with D.B. Cooper, take the time to look him up. The Great Escape from Alcatraz has become romanticized to the point that it's impossible not to have an opinion once you hear the story about the likelihood of their survival. There's a lot of people that they root for. Maybe they just want them to have escaped. Well, keep in mind that these are hardened lifelong criminals, so it's probably not a good thing if they escaped. The FBI obviously was called in pretty early on to assist. They officially closed the case in 1979, turned responsibility of the case over to the U.S. Marshal Service, which continues to investigate. There have been reports of sightings of the men as far away as South America, strange occurrences, greeting cards being sent to like the Anglin's mother, but no leads or claims have been substantiated. I'm going to come over here to our Google. So I've just got Google Maps pulled up here. This is from the U.S. Marshal's website. This is an age progression showing these wanted fugitives, Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin. They're wanted for escape. So this is, roughly what they would look like today if you ran across them. But for the most part, these federal agencies would probably consider them missing, presumed drowned. I think there's a lot of evidence that can continue to burn the debate and keep it going, keep it fueled. But as far as the agencies are concerned, they're probably not putting in a lot of man hours looking into these claims. Of course, the families, Morris and Anglin families, would continue to insist that they are alive and well. Not sure. I didn't do the math, see how old they would be today. Odds are it won't soon. So, this mystery can't go on forever. But right now, it's just a kind of maybe they made it, maybe they didn't. So most people who argue that the trio successfully escaped Alcatraz point to the lack of bodies. Their bodies were never found. Also, materials used in the escape were found near Angel Island, which is where they were trying to get to. People also point out that that knew the Anglin brothers described them as strong swimmers, and there have been children as young as 10 young teens that have swam that stretch from Alcatraz to Angel Island. So we know it is possible physically. The families maintain that they've been in contact. There's a photo. One of the nieces of the Anglins believes that they live in Brazil. Let me pull that back up. So here's a photo that has been confirmed to have been taken in 1975. Analysis of the individuals was inconclusive, so it could be them, but it could be two other guys that kind of look like them. He always, to me, looks like one of the Duke brothers, if y'all remember the Dukes of Hazzard. Bo or Luke, I don't know which one. So that they hold on to like this mysterious photograph of these two men that could look like the Anglin brothers shows up, and so that fuels that argument. The people that argue generally that the trio perished that night in the water have a lot of arguments to support their claims as well. First, a body was found. Probably a few months after the escape, a Norwegian ship spotted a body about 20 miles west of the Golden Gate in clothes very similar to those of Alcatraz inmates, a navy blue peacoat. The crew was unable to fish the body out of the sea, but they did file a report. and then that body was never recovered. On the claim that the bodies were never found, people that deny their success would argue that the bodies of suicidal jumpers from the Golden Gate Bridge are only recovered about half the time, the rest being lost to sea. So what that means is that the lack of bodies doesn't mean they didn't drown. You can't use the lack of evidence in this case to argue that they must have survived, because even either the day of or the next day, maybe the day before, in 1962, a man jumped and they never recovered his body. And that's really common. So those strong currents that we've talked about, that they're sometimes unforgiving. So there's not a guarantee that if they did drown, that their bodies would just be floating there for waiting to be found. One of the best arguments to deny their success is the fact that the three men were established criminals, lifelong criminals. Frank Morris, I think he had been in jail since his early teens. He was just in and out of trouble nonstop. So the idea that there was a possibility that all three of them vanished into thin air, none of them went back to a life, none of them robbed a gas station on their way out of town, none of them visited their family, stuck up a bank, none of them did anything that they've been doing their whole lives, is sometimes hard to believe. Another strong argument is that based on the tide patterns, the night of the escape, the men, very similar to when Rowe and Cole disappeared into the bay in 1937, would have entered the water at the very worst possible time. The water in the bay would reach its height around 8 p.m. that night, just 2 to 3 hours before the men were launching their raft. Over the next 4 hours, so from 8 to around midnight on moving into the 12th of June, the water level would drop about 2.5 feet. In other words, they entered the water when the largest volume of water was being pushed out to sea at the highest velocity. So that means if the raft had not been afloat perfectly, if they'd been taken on water, if their pea coats weighed them down, if they didn't take off their shoes and their shoes filled with water, Morris in particular, who was a smaller framed guy and not as strong of a swimmer, might have been taken under quickly after entering the water. So those factors, when we talk about the tide and the speed of the current, it's no joke. And the fact that it was at its worst just kind of puts that column of, like likelihood. This would be in the against likelihood category, very high up on the list. So things to make this possible, that they would have made it, you'd need a lot of strong evidence to support it, other than just kind of this circumstantial idea of, these two guys sitting by this. I don't even know what this is. Is that a rock, an anthill, termite mound? I don't know. That's proof, when the odds were heavily stacked against them as soon as they entered the water. Another important piece in the recovery of debris, one of the things that the investigators did find was a very carefully packaged like wallet or container with family photos of the Anglins, the names and addresses of contacts, and these investigators didn't really buy into the idea that family members could have helped them. There were some reports that they might have had help, like a boat waiting on them, and those claims are never backed up. The investigators found no evidence that the Anglins would have had money waiting on them or assistance. So these photos, these contacts that they would have used when they got to the mainland would have been like the most important property they had. So the idea that they would just ditch them in an effort to convince investigators that they didn't make it is pretty weak argument. this is probably their most important lifeline to survival if they wanted to not only survive the escape but to stay out. So the running theory would be that they would not abandon these items unless it was life or death. And then the strongest argument. This is the one. Like, if I were going to go back and say like I had to pick a side, I'm going to go on the record now and say I am not picking a side. I don't want to stay on the record, have a YouTube video out there saying that I don't think they made it, and then 5 years from now, John England show up on the news claiming I would have to choose likelihoods strongly that they drowned in the bay that night, didn't make it to Angel Island. And one of the strongest arguments that I go with on this is the attitude of many inmates that knew the Englands, in particular John. Some of those inmates that knew the brothers are certain of their failure because they don't believe that they could have kept quiet about it if they had succeeded. They would have had to have bragged about breaking the rock.